Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Book Club Favorites event, where we will be discussing Jennifer Egan's newest novel, The Candy House. We are joined today by Jennifer, who you may also know from her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad, or one of her other amazing works like Manhattan Beach. We are also joined by Brianna Yamashita and Stu Smith to help lead this conversation. Before we get into our discussion, I want to let everyone watching know that 5 lucky winners could win a copy of Jennifer's book, The Candy House, a signed book plate, and an adorable tote bag designed with the Candy House's cover. To enter for your chance to win, just leave a question for us in the comment section of this video, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can live today on screen. And now on to book club. Brianna and Stu, I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. That sounds like a fantastic giveaway, a tote bag and all those things. Today we are joined by Jennifer Egan, who of course has written the new book, The Candy House. It is a sibling novel to the Pulitzer Prize winning A Visit from the Goon Squad. Opens with a familiar character, Bix Booten. Bix has become a tech demigod since last we saw him. He is now in his 40s with 4 kids. He stumbles into a conversation group, mostly attended by Columbia professors, one of whom is experimenting with downloading one's memories. Within a decade, Bix's new technology, Own Your Unconscious, that allows you to access and have access to the ability and share every memory you've ever had, has seduced multitudes of people, but not everyone, as we come to find out. Hi, Jennifer. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Stu.
It's always lovely to talk to you. I think that everybody who's signing on today will have the very same first question, which is what inspired you to write The Candy House, to go back to some characters from A Visit from the Goon Squad?
Well, in a way, it was not really going back because I never really stopped thinking and writing about those people. I mean, the nature of these books is that each chapter, so that's my cat with a bell on it, each chapter is about a different person and from a different perspective. And so, and therefore each chapter introduces inevitably more characters that I can become curious about. And in a way, these books are really structured around curiosity. They're not chronological, either forward or backward, which is why The Candy House is not a sequel. You could just as easily call it a prequel because it actually, some of it takes place earlier in time than anything in Goon Squad. So even by the time I was on my book tour for A Visit from the Goon Squad, I was actually already working on a chapter of what became The Candy House. It was, that was obviously a long time ago. And the reason that I think it took as long as it did before this book was ready is that I wanted to wait and see whether the material was actually going to coalesce into something that really felt like its own entity, not just an echo of Goon Squad, not fan fiction of Goon Squad, but another story arc with its own sort of set of preoccupations and meaning.
So as you were writing these stories, you didn't quite know that this was going to be an entire second book. You were kind of just experimenting around at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote one chapter that was published actually as a novella called Black Box, which it has a very kind of extreme structure. It was tweeted by the New Yorker and it was written for Twitter at 140 characters. And it consists of basically a sequence of utterances by a female spy who has gone undercover to infiltrate a group of men that are believed to be plotting against America. So that one piece was published. And then I wrote a lot of first draft material in 2012 and 2013 at the same time that I was working on Manhattan Beach. And then I really put it in a drawer untyped because I write my first drafts by hand. And it was only in 2016 when I finished my novel Manhattan Beach that I pulled all of that material out and typed it up for the first time. So I wasn't really sure what was there. And a lot of what I typed up was not even, some of it I didn't even type. That's really a bad sign. But even of what I typed, about 50% was not really of great interest. And of course, the world had also, or American life was very different. I wrote originally in the Obama years, this material, and then I was picking it up after the election of Trump. And so I guess maybe all of those factors contributed to a sense that some of this material didn't feel relevant, but it was really starting in 2016 that I began thinking about what this could actually be and trying to kind of write toward that.
That's really interesting that they tweeted out that one, chapter that ended up being in the book. Did that sort of inspire the social media aspect of what would become the Candy House, or did that just kind of come along afterward?
The invention which you described, Stu, actually fell into place very late. Interestingly, I knew a lot more I knew what I wanted this machine to do for me narratively way before I knew what the machine actually was. I knew there would be an invention. That's an interesting question. I think that my interest in Twitter was not so much an interest in social media per se, although that became more of a preoccupation as the years went on, and I saw more and more how social media was really impacting people's lives, kind of internally and externally. I think initially what interested me about Twitter was much more the question of how I could use it to write fiction. When I see any form out there in the culture that is used for storytelling, my first question is, how can I use it? So that's what got me using PowerPoint in A Visit from the Goon Squad, and all kinds of other things. Twitter was kind of a natural target for me because it is a storytelling form very explicitly. And at 140 characters, the utterances on Twitter tended to look less like paragraphs and more like kind of artful, almost inadvertently poetic missives. I think maybe one reason Twitter ended up doubling the allowable space is that it was hard for people to actually say what they wanted to say in 140 characters, but that led to some interesting discourse that really piqued my curiosity. The other thing is I'm always interested in serialization, which was a structure, an organizing principle of a lot of 19th century fiction. And of course, now is the organizing principle of a lot of the television that we watch or streaming. And Twitter felt like a great way to, a great genre to investigate for its potential for serialization by having a sequence of tweets tell a story.
Okay.
And Jenny, we had a couple of questions from the audience about your process and your writing process, and also whether any part of the book surprised you or the writing of the book surprised you as you were writing.
Well, in a way, I can answer those at once. My writing process is built around being surprised because the ideas I have sitting in a chair and thinking, what should I write, are not good enough. They just don't cut it. So my writing process is geared toward unlocking the part of my brain that contains more information than I have ready access to and better ideas. So the way I try to do that is that I write fiction mostly by hand. I alluded earlier to handwritten drafts, and that's normal for me. I use yellow legal pads, and I try to write about 5 pages by hand a day when I'm working on original material. And there are many reasons I think that handwriting works for me to try to bring about the surprises that I'm seeking. One of which is my handwriting is really bad and very hard to read. So there's a kind of inherent blindness in the process that I love. As a journalist, I write on a computer, and writing is inherently rewriting, because the minute you see something in front of you in a typeface, the inadequacies of it become immediately apparent, and there's this constant backtracking. That does not work for me with fiction, because what I'm trying to enter into, I've come to realize, is a kind of improvisational state of mind. I've never done theatrical or musical improv, but I've watched and listened to it, and it feels very similar. It's the kind of searching, in that case, collectively for a sort of line of narrative, if you will, that feels alive, and just leaning into that and kind of pushing into it. And that's very much what I'm doing when I write my first drafts. Ultimately, I type it up, I read it over, then now I'm subjecting it to a much more analytical framework. And at that point, I begin to get a sense of what it could be, if it even feels like it could be anything. As I mentioned, 50% of what I wrote initially for the Candy House just didn't feel like it was interesting enough. But if it is, I type it. I mean, I read it over, I make an outline, and I try to figure out what I can do concretely to push it closer to what I think it could ultimately be.
It's funny you mentioned your handwriting, because I would say that anybody who wants to see your actual handwriting, you have this great feature on your website at jenniferegan.com where you can actually see the various drafts in progress. Where you click, it's like a discovery thing. You click around and then you see like the typed up draft, and then the draft beneath that's kind of like I guess the roughest draft. And it's amazing how much you edit yourself out. You just pages and pages, like just cross out.
Yes. And also, if there are a couple of chapters, so you can do that for every single chapter. If you hover over the published, what you see is the published version. And if you hover over the first paragraph, you essentially peel that away and go down through the layers. And in some cases, there are layers even beneath the handwritten first draft. And those are unsuccessful prior attempts at first drafts. So yeah, it's you can actually do a kind of excavation to see how it works.
It's so interesting that you've chronicled so much of it and given everybody so much access to it. I mean, I don't know that everybody would want access to all of that. There is one question from the audience I find interesting. They ask, could you read these novels as standalones? I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I didn't reread A Visit from the Goon Squad until I was almost done with The Candy House. And honestly, I wished I had reread it earlier because I had gotten some facts wrong about my own characters that in a couple of cases required some real sort of contortions to undo. They stand completely on their own. And in a way, that's one of the organizing principles of both books, in which each chapter also stands completely on its own. In Goon Squad, every chapter except the last two was published individually as a short story before the book was published. In The Candy House, I didn't do that on purpose because I really knew it would be a book, and I didn't want to, I didn't want the material to be too familiar. So only 2 chapters were published before it was finished. But yes, they're completely standalone. And if you wanted to read both, I actually have come to feel that maybe it would be more fun to start with Candy House and then read Goon Squad.
I actually would agree with that. I think that's perfect. I'm having my friends do that right now. I am wondering, you're out on tour right now. You're touring all over the country. And have you, for Goon Squad, you were getting a lot of feedback on a certain chapter. Is there anything in Candy House, any one chapter, any one character you've gotten a lot of feedback on that maybe people have connected to?
I think maybe the one that people mention the most often is the one that consists completely of sort of electronic communications. It's not clear whether it's email. It's taking place in 2035, so there's really no reason to kind of name the kind of electronic communication it is. Some people have said it's like a Slack chat, and the funny thing is that there's nothing new. I mean, so I would call that an epistolary chapter. And epistolary novels, the novels that consist completely of letters, are as old as the novel itself, really. One of the great 18th century novels, Clarissa, by Samuel Richardson, is all letters. I think that's still the longest novel written in English. So in a way, that was low-hanging fruit for me. I mean, I'm always on the hunt for ways to write fiction. And in these books, I'm particularly needy for new forms, because one of the ideas behind these books is that each chapter will feel like it has a different mood and tone and vibe. Basically, each chapter will feel like it's part of a different book. So I'm, at a certain point, I start to feel like, what else can I do? And so I had been wanting to use letters for a long time. But one thing I've really found about using any sort of unusual form is that first of all, it's just really hard to make it work. It's not like you can take a chapter written conventionally and say, oh, okay, now I'm going to do this in the form of letters. That never works. The only way it has ever worked for me to use an even slightly unusual form is to find a story that can only be told that way. And that can involve a lot of waiting.
Yeah.
So there, that, but yes, so that chapter seems to have been notable in this book, I guess, much the way the PowerPoint was in A Visit from the Goon Squad.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, you have like all these different characters, like every chapter is a different person. Is there one that's like a personal favorite to you that, was really a joy to write and that you just kind of loved?
They really all are. I mean, if I don't have a joy in writing them, that's a sign that it's not going to go well. I don't, none of the, I don't write about myself. I guess that's something else I should mention. I'm exactly the opposite of an autofiction practitioner. I'm not interested in writing about myself. For me, the joy of writing is specifically the feeling of being delivered out of my daily life. So, so that is a really critical factor in my process. And therefore, every person who ends up in there is someone unknown to me whom I became deeply familiar with in the course of writing. And the kind of empathy and really allegiance that I need to feel to someone to be able to pull this off is really intense. And sometimes the further they are from me, the more allegiance I end up feeling in a funny way, maybe because of the stretch that has given me. So I guess, I mean, there's one character who, most of the characters I write about in Candy House are very minor characters in Goon Squad, sometimes to the point of not even having been physically present in the book, but only mentioned by name. One exception is a guy named Lou Klein, who is a record producer. We see a fair amount of him in Goon Squad. We see other people close to him. And his family unit is really the one that I think you could argue I deal with pretty deeply in both books. And he's a tremendously problematic character, multiply divorced, not, in some ways not a very good father to some of his children, seduces a high schooler, and makes her life very difficult as a result. I mean, this is someone who, especially with a contemporary sensibility, is sort of a nightmare. But I guess maybe for that reason, it was all the more important to me to not only find his humanity, because that's the very bare minimum that has to happen if I'm writing about someone, but to reveal him from another angle, in which he feels, sympathetic, actually sympathetic. And maybe that's why I was drawn to him again. But maybe too, it was that because of his very complicated family situation, there were a lot of people close to him that I was interested in, namely his children. And so he inevitably came back into the mix as a result.
Yeah.
And is there anything, I'm just curious, is there anything you do to get in like the headspace of these characters? Like, do you have some sort of process that you sit down and like, you're going to spend time with just this one character that day?
No, I don't really need to do that somehow. I mean, my entry point is not even character so much as time and place. And I find that's the headspace I have to find, is basically one of atmosphere. Sort of what is the feeling of where we are? And then if I start there and then write in this kind of more blind, automatic way, the people seem to come along naturally. And then what I'm doing when I continue writing about someone who has appeared in that way is following whatever clues intrigued me in the first place and seeing what kind of life they lead into. So it's sort of the opposite of what you might think, which is, I'm going to write about X, Y, or Z person. Here, I'm going to tell you these little things, and then I'm going to tell you a few more little things. That's not how it works. I am seeing a few little things that seem interesting, and I am following them into what feels like a discovery to me, which is the life that is attached to them.
We got a very fun reader question, which was, would you join the Mandela Cube? Now, can you take a moment to explain what the cube is and then whether you would?
Yeah, so the cube is allows people to externalize their consciousnesses, in other words, the entirety of their memories in full, and continue to update them. So each time they reattach electrodes to their heads and do this uploading process, they are capturing whatever memories or experiences have happened to them since the last time they did it. And it's a very private tool. In other words, there's, this can just be for one's own use, and there are many uses for it. One of which is to use it as kind of a hedge against traumatic brain injury or ultimately dementia. The idea is that you can reinfuse this whole memory and substitute that for whatever memory is failing for whatever reason. That's very appealing to me as someone with a lot of dementia in my family. So the answer is it's very appealing. It would be hard to resist. There's a second possibility, which is to share all or part of the content of the cube to the collective consciousness. And people do that as the cost of entry to gain access to that consciousness, to that collective, which includes the all or part of the consciousnesses of everyone else who has done the same. That is a taller order, although, again, a little hard to resist because of my own curiosity to view other people's consciousnesses. That's what fiction is and does. So I would be, very tempted, but of course, a little reluctant to share my own. And the funny thing is, people have said to me, oh, this feels like it's about to happen. And the truth is, it could never happen, I don't think, because we don't understand the brain well enough to do this. I think the reason it feels like it's about to happen is that, in essence, it has happened. And the collective consciousness is the internet, where there is so much more about all of us than I think we even fully realize. And I'm not even counting all of the data collection that's happening behind the scenes. I just mean what is actually findable by a person who wants to look. And the truth is that whether or not we are sharing a lot about our lives online, which I do not, I never post pictures of my children. I don't have that impulse. It doesn't matter because so many other people are doing that. We are all represented. And a good analogy would be DNA analysis. Whether or not you have done 23andMe and made your results available as the price of finding out whether you have any relatives out there you didn't know about, whether or not you've done that, we are all in North America represented in that database at this point, because enough people close to us have done it that we're essentially there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've had a lot of questions from the audience about what you are reading right now.
Well, I'm always reading 19th century fiction. So that's one thing. I find it just, well, first of all, I love it on audio. I'm an audiobook maniac. And for me, 19th century fiction works wonderfully on audio because these are really long books. You can sort of get in and stay in. So I just finished Dickens's first serialized novel, which is The Pickwick Papers, which was a lot of fun. So I'm always doing that. Then I've gotten very interested in 1950s detective fiction. And I just started last night. There's a series with a hero named Nero Wolfe. These are all out of print now, I believe. And in a way, rightly so. I mean, the sexism is I mean, I read a paragraph to my husband because I found it hilarious that you could actually say this in a book and people weren't rioting. It doesn't bother me at all. Like, what do I care? It's just a fascinating, really, time capsule. It's one of the reasons I love fiction written outside of my lifetime. It's a real measure of how human life has changed. Anyway, I'm very interested in detective stories from the 50s. So I'm reading this. Nero Wolfe is a really sort of sedentary, extremely overweight guy who likes to tend orchids in his greenhouse, which is on the roof of his townhouse in New York City. So that's what I just started.
That's fascinating. I have to ask you this one question because I heard you speak to it in another event. I thought it was fascinating. I know you do some research for this, and this book does include D&D in it, Dungeons and Dragons. And I hear you had a pretty close to home resource for your research.
Yes, there's a lot of baseball and Dungeons and Dragons in this book, and both of those preoccupations, let's say, really came from my kids. I had one avid baseball player and one avid Dungeons and Dragons player, and there was a period where we would actually have a group doing both of those things on one day a week. The baseball kids would play Stratomatic, which is a statistical baseball game that you play on paper. I've never really understood it. It's actually a very old game. I think it goes back to even maybe the 1930s. And then the Dungeons and Dragons kids were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I would bring them all home on the same day from school, and then I would bake for them. And so while I was baking, I would get to eavesdrop on the Dungeons and Dragons kids who were playing in the kitchen. And I started thinking a lot about the kind of storytelling that I was hearing. And particularly what interested me was the numerical underpinnings of D&D. And I think a lot of video games too, because as I understand it, the structure of a lot of online games now actually in some ways mimics or is a response to Dungeons and Dragons, in which character creation has a lot of I don't know if I would say math, but numbers underneath it. People, you roll a dice to ascribe strengths and weaknesses to certain personality traits. And so I found myself thinking a lot about that and how I could use it in this book. So even though I never write about myself, I see a lot of parenthood, actually, my own experience of parenthood. And I now have an empty nest. They're both in college. There's a lot of a kind of loving nostalgia for the kind of storytelling that my kids introduced me to.
We've gotten a lot of compliments on the cover of this book, and I wanted to ask if you could walk us through the process for it. Did you know immediately that you wanted this beautiful candy-coated cover, or what were your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure I've ever experienced a more a longer process of trying to find the right cover. It really took a while. One big question is, I think it's always hard with a book like this, in which there's so many different centers of gravity, really each chapter having its own. And so the question is like, if you use, say, figurative elements from a particular chapter, I would even find myself thinking, what is that? And why is it there? I couldn't even understand how it related to it, and I wrote it. And I think part of that was that nothing really was representative of every chapter. So I think in retrospect, it was a book in which the cover needed to not have figures in it of any kind. But then the question is what? And it really took a while. There was a lot of trial and error in the process. But I think when we saw this one, we all recognized that it was great. And what I was so happy about it, two things. One is the designer who ended up designing this is the one who tried the most times. So I felt like that's a designer who designs the way I write. Lots of drafts, lots of trial and error, willing to keep going and not be deterred by the fact that it hadn't happened yet. And the other thing is, it's the same designer who did the paperback of A Visit from the Goon Squad, which I also really, really love. And so I think they look good together and sort of feel connected together. And I love the cover because I'm someone who loves wrapping presents. I love ribbons. I love bells. I love wrapping paper. I have tons of it. And to me, it looks like a present. So that I'm crazy about the cover. I usually start to feel a little tired of the cover after a couple of weeks, but I adore it.
Oh, good. No cover fatigue. That's fantastic.
No cover fatigue.
All right, Colleen, I think you're taking us home.
Yes, and I do have to say the cover is stunning and it definitely stands out on a shelf, which is always ideal. So I just wanted to thank you all for such an incredible discussion. And before we go, I just wanted to give one last reminder that you can still post a question in the comment section to be entered to win our Candy House sweepstakes. Our next book club favorites pick will be Jennifer Weiner's The Summer Place. So you can join our Facebook group or follow us on Instagram for the latest updates. And finally, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. You
Thank
can
you.
find out more about the Candy House at jenniferegan.com. And I just want to wish everyone a really lovely afternoon. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Lots of fun.